Come on in and have a seat. This is such an exciting evening, and look at the backdrop. You can't do much better than that, huh? Watch the pelicans fly by. So my name is Kathryn Mitchell. I'm the Dean of the Social Sciences, and I'm so delighted to welcome you to the 2022 Confronting Climate Change lecture panel series. Panel series is always better than lectures, in my opinion. Get to actually have a conversation with smart people. And the name of the series tonight is Responding to the Impacts of Climate Change in Santa Cruz County. So we have a nice local focus tonight, although I'm sure we'll be making links to broader global issues as well. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few housekeeping details. For those joining remotely by webinar, please submit your questions into the Q&A box. You're invited to enter those at any time, and there will be time set aside at the end of the panel discussion for people to answer your questions. Those in the room can fill out questions on the handy white pieces of paper that are left on your seats, and just hold them up, and our event staff will come by and pick them up. And finally, closed caption is enabled, and tonight's event will be recorded. To start the program, I would like to first provide a land acknowledgement and to thank Chairman Lopez, who's here with us this evening, of the Ama Mutsun Tribal Band for joining us tonight as one of our panelists. The land on which we gather is the unceded territory of the Awaswas-speaking UP tribe. The Ama Mutsun Tribal Band is comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast. Today, the Ama Mutsun tribe and Ama Mutsun Land Trust are working to restore traditional land stewardship to these lands to ensure the ancestors of both the Awaswas and Mutsun-speaking ancestors are honored and never forgotten. All people are asked to support these efforts. You can learn more about the tribe at amamutsun.org and also amamutsunlandtrust.org. Those are one words, .org. So in terms of our event background tonight of Confronting Climate Change, it's an annual public lecture series, and it brings together scientists, policymakers, artists, and concerned community members to discuss our planet's well-being and to share solutions for our future. Our annual event typically draws more than 500 attendees. At tonight's event, we will take a deep dive into climate impacts at home here on the Central Coast and also around the world with UC Santa Cruz scientists and community leaders in conservation, climate resilience, and sustainability. This annual event was launched by the former Dean of the Social Sciences, Sheldon Kamenecki, who's watching us tonight, and the current Dean of the Physical and Biological Sciences, Paul Koch, who will close the program tonight. So thank you both for starting this important series. And thank you, Sheldon. So we're excited for it to be hosted this year at the Seymour Marine Discovery Center, an institute at the forefront of educating the community about the role scientific research plays in the understanding and conservation of the world's oceans through public programming and research. And thank you, Jonathan, for a wonderful speech at the reception. And I'd like to begin by introducing Sakina Jinnah. I will turn the program over to Dr. Jinnah, who's the MC and moderator for tonight's program, and she will introduce each of the speakers. So first, I'd like to give a little introduction. Dr. Jinnah is an associate professor of environmental studies. Yay. And an affiliated graduate faculty of politics at the University of California at Santa Cruz. She's also a 2017 Andrew Carnegie Fellow, incredibly competitive fellowship process to get that award, co-editor of the journal Environmental Politics, and a member of the advisory committee for Harvard University's Stratospheric Controlled Perturbation Experiment. Sakina's research examines global environmental governance with a focus on climate change, solar geoengineering, and the nexus between international trade and environmental politics. Most recently, she has been working to develop theoretically derived recommendations for the governance of solar geoengineering technologies. She is the author or editor of 5 books, including Post-Treaty Politics, which received the 2016 Harold and Margaret Sprout Award for the best book in environmental studies from the International Studies Association, and Greening Through Trade, which was a finalist for the 2021 Canadian Political Science Association Prize in International Relations. Sakina, I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Welcome, everyone. I'm very honored to have been invited by Jonathan to come and moderate this event. I'm so excited to hear from this amazing panel of speakers. I'm going to briefly introduce them now, and then just prior to each of their talks, I'll give a more detailed introduction to each of them. So at the far end, we have Dr. Katie Cito. Katie will be talking to us about environmental justice. She's an assistant professor with me in the Environmental Studies Department at UC Santa Cruz. Our second speaker, we're going to jump to the middle, will be Sherry Flumerfeldt. And Sherry is the executive director of the Monterey Bay Fisheries Trust, and she'll be speaking about food security issues. Third, we'll have Borja Reguero, who is an associate research professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz as well. And he will be speaking with us about sea level rise and storms. And finally, we have the honor of having Chairman Lopez with us this evening. Chairman Lopez is the chairman of the Amamutsin Tribal Band, and he'll be speaking with us about some of his work in Santa Cruz as well. So with that, Katie will be first. And Katie, as I mentioned, is an assistant professor in the Environmental Studies Department at UC Santa Cruz. Her research lies at the intersection of political ecology, governance theory, and sustainability science. Using frameworks from each of these fields, her research investigates the equity, sustainability, and governance of marine and coastal systems and the reciprocal relationships they have with human well-being and conflict.
Thank you, Sakina. So thanks, everyone, for having us. I think this is the first speaking engagement for many of us post-pandemic, so please bear with us. I wanted to start by just pointing out that some of the most important considerations in climate change are how these environmental changes are going to impact on human communities, and specifically how they're going to impact different communities differently. So most people in this room know this, but the effects of climate change are not going to be distributed evenly. And instead, some of the sort of harshest and earliest climate realities are going to be faced by people that are lower income, more vulnerable, and poorer, both here and abroad. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, let's start with fish. So just bear with me for a second, but who in this room has ever eaten tuna? Right, okay, I'm not seafood shaming anyone tonight, so don't be shy. Exactly, so most people have eaten tuna, right? So if you grew up, especially in the tuna heyday of the 1950s to the 1990s, tuna was probably a big part of your childhood. Okay, so just one more. So of the people in this room, how many of you still encounter tuna pretty regularly in your life? Maybe it's on the menu at school or work, or you eat it, or it's in your kids' diets. Yeah, okay, so still a lot of us, right? It's really common. And the last time I checked, tuna is still the #1 fish eaten by people in the USA. But what you might not know is the fact that most of the tuna that people eat comes from the Western and Central Pacific Ocean, from both the high seas and from the waters of small island developing states and territories. So places like the Republic of Kiribati or the Federated States of Micronesia or Tokelau. And you also might not know that these stocks specifically are some of the most sustainably managed tuna stocks in the world. And the reason for this is because most of that tuna, so over 1 million tons a year, comes from the waters of these small island nations. And they have the sovereign right to manage and to fish for the tuna in these waters. And they can then sell that right to other boats, which becomes a huge part of the revenue of their country. And so kind of noting the importance of that revenue, 9 different nations have come together to create a cooperative management agreement that works to cap the number of total fishing days that you can fish in any of their waters. And it's really one of the strongest management arrangements of any transboundary fishery. But climate change is set to really alter that cooperative management agreement. So when we think about climate change, a lot of times it's easy to think about the direct effects, right? So things like seas rising higher, land getting drier, weather getting warmer. What's harder to think about are the indirect or the more complex things like ocean acidification or saltwater intrusion or increasing storm frequency and intensity. So for tuna in the Pacific, these indirect effects mean movement, and maybe not the movement that you'd necessarily think about. So for these tuna, rather than moving poleward, which is what we oftentimes think about with animals, these fish are going to move east. And I'm not going to drag you into an oceanography rabbit hole, but I'll just say the reason for this is there's something called the Western Pacific Worm Pool. And there's tuna that, a lot like people, me included, some tuna really like warm water. And so this worm pool is expected to shift east, and so will the tuna that are associated with it. And so, okay, tuna are going to move east rather than north or south, no big deal. In fact, in places like Santa Cruz, we're expected to see an increase in tuna stocks like ahi, which is yellowfin, or big-eye tuna. But what it will mean is the fact that a lot of these tuna stocks are going to move out of the waters of these small island nations and into the high seas. So there's 2 implications of this that are really important. One, when that happens, these small island nations will no longer be entitled to the revenue from these access fees. And in some of these places, this revenue represents 84% of their total government revenue, right? So things like hospitals and education and roads will no longer have the support that they need in these developing economies. And the second bit is, as these fish move east, they're going to move into the high seas, which means less management, less regulation, and increasing risk to the sustainability of the stock. So all of this represents a climate justice issue, right? Because in addition to things like sea level rise, these island nations are also having to contend with losses of food and revenue that support their developing economies. Thanks, Jonathan. So these climate justice issues happen all around the world, and they happen right here in Santa Cruz as well. So we've started to look at some issues of equity here in Santa Cruz with projections of sea level rise, and we're finding really similar challenges. So here it's not tuna revenue and redistributions, but the simple issue of access to the coast and how that's distributed differently between different communities. And what we're finding is that as sea levels rise, it's disadvantaged communities like the mobility impaired and low-income folks that are going to disproportionately see their access to the coast diminished. So here in Santa Cruz, there's not much we can do about redistributing tuna stocks, but there is a lot we can do about climate justice issues here. So things like increasing free access to the coast, increasing public transportation to coastal access points, and increasing things like infrastructure and accessibility like wheelchairs and bathrooms are things that we can do here to address the the climate justice issues right at home. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. And we'll probably ask you to expand on some of those, what we can do here to address climate justice in the discussion later. Next up, we have Sherry Flumerfeldt. Sherry is the executive director at the Monterey Bay Fisheries Trust. She has spent the last 2 decades working with coastal communities to find balance between environmental and economic sustainability. She also spent 8 years as a consultant on a range of fisheries and conservation projects, supporting clients such as the Environmental Defense Fund, Catch Alaska, the Marine Life Protection Act Initiative, EcoTrust, and the California Fisheries Fund.
Thank you. So here in Monterey Bay, we have an active commercial fishing fleet. There are men and women out on the bay every day catching rockfish and lingcod, sablefish, king salmon, Dungeness crab, and more. And they are on the front lines of climate change. They are the first to see changes. It's part of their job to be very observant of what's happening on the ocean. And so if you go and talk to a fisherman out on the docks, they'll tell you all sorts of stories of changes that they're seeing. But I'm going to focus on one of those changes related to climate change that has had a really big impact on our local fishing community, and that's related to Dungeness crab. So Dungeness crab is a really important fishery here in Monterey Bay. It's one of the most lucrative fisheries. Until recently, it was the highest value fishery, and it usually runs from November until June. And so most of you, I'm assuming a lot of you are Californian, and you love your Dungeness crab at Thanksgiving and Christmas. I'm Canadian. I always found that a little bizarre, but that's okay. But that is really the best time of year for these commercial fishermen and women and that participate in the crab fishery. But in 2014 to 2016, there was the North Pacific Marine Heat Wave, or the warm blob, and that had unprecedented temperatures off the West Coast. And this caused harmful algal blooms, which in turn increased domoic acid in Dungeness crab and other shellfish. And domoic acid is very toxic to humans. If you eat it, it's anywhere from dizziness and nausea to comas and death. So the fishery was shut down to protect public health. Fishermen missed Thanksgiving, Christmas, and in fact, in 2016, it was delayed by 4 months. So imagine going without your paycheck for 4 months. It was really an economic hardship for the local fishing community. And so what happened is, when it finally did open, they were scrambling to catch up and make a living off of the income that they'd lost. So there was a higher density of crab pots out on the water than there usually is in May and June. Usually by that time, they're clearing out and getting ready for salmon season. At the same time, because of this warming, there was a shift in the prey, or change in the abundance of prey. Krill had died off, and the whales, prey for whales. The whales were going after anchovies, which were nearer to shore. So it was this perfect storm. There were more crab pots out on the water, and there were more whales near shore, and this caused a terrible increase in entanglements between Dungeness crab gear and whales. And so in 2016, there were 61, I believe. 61, and 11 were confirmed in commercial Dungeness crab gear. And in 2017, this is on the whole West Coast, there were 71 entanglements with whale gear, which had never happened. It was a really awful spike. And another, not only was this really tragic in so many ways, what happened was fishermen got a really bad rep. People were targeting the fishing community as murderers and don't eat Dungeness crab and look at what these people are doing. So it was really devastating for them in so many ways as well. So I was asked to talk about some of the solutions to this entanglement issue. And I do feel really optimistic about solutions that engage the fishing community. And so in 2015, one of the things that happened is a Dungeness crab gear working group was formed. And this working group consisted of members of the commercial fishing community, scientists, conservationists, government, and so on. And they all came together to try to address the entanglement issue and try to come up with some solutions. So they looked at best practices for fishing. They changed some of the ways that they were fishing. They looked at having early closures, trying to monitor when there was a density of whales in the area, and they came up with some steps and good ideas, actions that could be taken. And then in 2020, after a number of things happened, which I won't get into the weeds on, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife implemented what's known as the RAMP program, in which the Director of Fish and Wildlife can implement a number of actions to reduce entanglements. They have boats going out on the water and aerial surveys trying to follow the whales, and fishermen are very much involved with this. They're the ones on the planes checking to see what's happening. They are super involved, and they can close the fishery, which happened this year, as many of you might know. The fishery was closed here a couple months earlier, and in other places on the coast a few months early. because there were a few entanglements. So they stopped it. So there were 3 entanglements. Another solution that's collaborative is the Lost Gear Recovery Project. We actually at the Monterey Bay Fisheries Trust run the project out of Santa Cruz, Monterey, and Moss Landing, and it is a collaboration among fishermen and local harbors and boaters and so on to try and get every last gear off the water to prevent any entanglements. And finally, there are gear innovations that are happening where it's ropeless gear. These are still being tested. They're not yet proven, but they're a promising solution for when there's an increase in whales in the area, of which there are because, happily, the whale populations are on the rise. And so there are solutions. They're engaging the fishing community. Those are the ones that will work. Sometimes solutions are brought in that don't involve them, and you see a lot of resistance, and hopefully we'll keep working with the fishing community, supporting them, realizing that climate change is complex, and a number of issues happen that we're not always aware of. So please support our fishing community.
Thanks, Sherry. And I think we might come back to some of those livelihood impacts and a discussion of climate justice in the discussion as well. Next up, we have Borja Reguero. He is an associate research professor at UC Santa Cruz. His work spans areas of climate change in coastal areas, socioeconomic impacts of coastal hazards, and climate resilience and adaptation. His research is centered on ocean waves, climate change, the physical processes that govern coastal flooding and erosion, and how ecosystems influence them, including how environmental degradation contributes to climate risks.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to shift the focus into climate change and coastal areas. In our group, we do 2 things. We assess coastal risk, and also we implement innovative solutions. In terms of risk, we look at how climate change is affecting flooding and erosion impacts, and also we look at the socioeconomic effects. In terms of solutions, we work with innovative nature-based adaptation options, like the use of reef restoration to protect communities, but also we look into insurance mechanisms that can protect both nature and people. Our work is both nationally and internationally, and we work through projects with the Nature Conservancy, the World Bank, and different agencies like FEMA, NOAA, US Corps, and the Department of Interior. And we see that our work here is having a lot of traction, both in terms of policy, but also practice. So in this experience, in my experience, something that I've seen in coastal impacts is that we often overlook we often overlook in our focus to trying to project sea level rise, including that in adaptation planning. We often overlook the extreme short-term extreme events. And that's like, for example, waves atop high sea levels, high tides, but also king tides, hurricanes in other coastlines. Here in California is El Niño, Southern Oscillation, El Niño years. So these events, these short-term extreme events are going to have more impact on our coasts and our coastlines than what we will expect at least until the mid-century by sea level rise itself, which is growing at around 4 to 5 millimeters per year. So it's really important to understand how those extremes are changing. There is also a compounding effect, because the sea level, as sea level rise is increasing, it's also affecting those extremes and making them more intense and also more frequent. Part of my work focuses specifically on waves as a very good example of this an important coastal driver. So I've been demonstrating how waves are becoming larger, both globally and locally, and this is accelerating both flooding and erosion. So it's really important to account for these factors and understand better how they are changing, in addition to sea level rise. So what we can do about it? The good news is there is a number of options possible. Obviously, there are some physical interventions, but there are also climate policy and risk management tools and options. And I wanted to give you some examples. In terms of physical interventions, we can implement traditional coastal engineering protection, for example, but there are also a lot of innovation now going on into nature-based adaptation. So some of the work that we do here for coral reef environments, and using reef restoration projects are having a lot of traction. And actually, the states of Guam and Hawaii passed new legislative proposal based on the studies that we develop here, just because these ecosystems have an actual value for protecting people. But I wanted to share with you also 3 examples, more local examples, and also how it's influencing climate policy here in the state and in the city. So the first one is the Mexico Reef Insurance that we developed with the Nature Conservancy a few years ago. So that pilot has informed new climate policy in California. So 2 years ago, the Senate passed a bill that now the Insurance Commissioner Office is implementing to explore nature-based solutions and insurance mechanisms together. The second example that I wanted to mention is a pilot initiative that we lead in this campus. Is called the Multi-Campus Initiative on Coastal Resilience and Adaptation. And this is a multi-campus collaboration between 3 campuses for now, where we work with communities trying to identify what are the specific needs, what are the specific gaps in science that you see as the largest public university globally should be developing to help scale up and also implement adaptation more effectively. And the last example that I wanted to share with you is a long-lasting partnership with the city of Santa Cruz, where through the Coastal and Science Policy Program, the students have been, for 4 years now, involved in local adaptation planning efforts. So they run mini projects with the city, very closely with the city, and supported by this campus. And they have been helping advance the adaptation agenda locally. So some of the examples are, for example, new monitoring technologies, but also most recently citizen-based science tools that we are exploring and we would like to implement in the very short term. These are just some examples of how this campus is having a lot of momentum locally and also nationally, internationally. And I wanted to wrap up just with a vision or a shared thought. And I think there is a lot of potential. I think we have had a lot of impact already and traction, as I said, both nationally and internationally. And this is result of high impact science, but it's also a result of a very strong partnership with the community and a network that we have been developing, not only with the city, but also with the stakeholders here, private sector, startups, and critical partners like the U.S. Geological Survey Pacific Center, which has been instrumental in developing this science. And I think we have a lot of potential to continue to grow and keep developing science-based solutions for scaling up adaptation and face climate change in coastal areas. So thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the discussion now.
Thank you. Our final speaker this evening is Chairman Valentin Lopez, who is the chairman of the Amamutsan Tribal Band. He is a Native American advisor to the University of California Office of the President on issues related to repatriation. He is also a Native American advisor to the National Alliance on Mental Illness and the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. Chairman Lopez is working to restore the Mutsun language and is actively involved in efforts to restore traditional indigenous knowledge and ensure that tribal history is accurately told. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. I don't have a PhD. I tell people, in jest, of course, that I graduated from Gilroy Barber College. So that's who you're dealing with tonight. You know, our creation story, I'm going to give a little bit of background. Our creation story tells us that Creator very specifically picked our people to live on these lands. It's our responsibility to take care of these lands, you know, and we have that responsibility to take care of these lands. We have the moral authority and the moral responsibility to take care of these lands because that obligation was given to us by Creator. Our people took that responsibility very seriously. Our people recognized, you know, we had the responsibility to take care of all living things. We had the responsibility to ensure the fish, the birds, the four-legged, the plants and all the rivers, the waters, were all taken care of and stewarded. And our people did that for thousands and thousands of years. You know, our people have been here for 12, 14, 15,000 years or more. And if you think of that in terms of generations, that's 800, 900, perhaps 1,000 generations or more that our people have been here. And each generation they learn more and more about the plants, about the water, about the fish. And they pass that knowledge on to the next generation. And on and on. Our people learned a lot about how to take care of this planet and these lands. They learned to use fire as a tool. They learned how to have, the most important thing they learned was that Mother Earth was sacred. And they had a responsibility to maintain that sacredness here on the world that we live in. How many of you in your classes in all your science classes or any class here, talk about restoring the sacredness or maintaining the sacredness of the lands? That is never mentioned. And yet that's the most important thing. That is the most important thing for you to realize. Creator made this land, and he made it sacred. Our people developed ceremonies, prayers, ways of reciprocation, ways of recognizing that those plants, those fish, those four-legged, are our relatives. They have the same Father that we do, Creator. That plant, I look out there, the trees, the oceans, they have the same Father we do, Creator. They have the same mother we do, Mother Earth. They are our relatives. And the way that we love our children, the way that we love our relatives, we talk to them, we're patient with them, we're gentle with them, we sing to them, we listen to them. That's the way we must take care of Mother Earth today. That's the way we must take care of these oceans, the fish, the water. That's what our people learned for those thousands of years. And then came that brutal period of colonization where they thought that we were just simple hunters and gatherers. You read the books today, they say they're hunters and gatherers. They're no different than the cave man, the cave woman. They have no knowledge. They have nothing of importance to tell us, to teach us, to show us. In all three periods of brutal colonization, they wanted to destroy our spirituality. They wanted to destroy our sacredness. They wanted to destroy our indigenous knowledge. They wanted to destroy our environment. And they did a pretty darn good job of that. They did a pretty darn good job of that. At the turn of the century in 1900, our population was reduced by over 98%. And we lived underground in poverty and facing a lot of difficult times. But we're coming back today. Little by little, we're coming back. I was one of the very first and few so far that went to college. And when I got to college, I remember I was taking psychology, anthropology, all these other classes. I knew what they meant, but science, I go, what the heck does science mean? I had no idea what science meant. Nobody ever taught me. My parents didn't teach me that word, That's not a word that was ever mentioned in our house. What does science mean? And so I got on my bike and I rode down to campus and I went to the library because I figured they had a better dictionary than the little cheapie I carried in my pocket. And I looked up science. Science, very simply, is a study of knowledge. And when you look at it that way, our ancestors, for those thousands and thousands of generations, were scientists. They learned how to take care of these lands. When they wiped them out, they lost so much of that knowledge. They learned how to manage these landscapes by using fire, knowing that when you have frequent burns, that those fires are very low impact, and they just kind of creep along the ground, and they're easy to manage and control. Our people would burn every 5, 7, 8 years. And then That kept the fuel loads down. It kept away those horrendous and catastrophic fires that we experience here on a regular basis now, not only in California, but throughout the United States now. Our people learned how to control that. If our people were still managing these landscapes, we'd be fine. They also learned that whenever at home, when I filter my water, I use one of those Brita water filters. That Brita water filter is charcoal. After a burn, you have a lot of charcoal. So when you get rain, that charcoal filters the water as it runs down to the rivers, the creeks, and the oceans. You're filtering that water. By doing away with all that big brush buildup and stuff like that, when it rains, more of that land comes down to the ground level, and it flows and runs away. That's important. And so our people have learned a lot about how to take care of this world and the animals. For fish, for salmon, our people learned how to take care of the salmon, the habitat. So whenever they come in, they transition from salt water to fresh water. That takes a period of time. So we made sure there was a lot of resources there so they could get their strength. When they started going upriver, we never fished the first group of salmon going up the river because we realized they were the most genetically strongest. They had the strongest determination, and they were the bravest, and they had all the qualities that the salmon needed to survive and perpetuate that species. And then after that first week or 2 weeks, we would go through and start fishing. These are a lot of lessons. Don't forget the indigenous people were here. Today we do a lot of research. We do a lot of research with UC Santa Cruz, Berkeley, Stanford, UCLA. That's not research, that's validation. The validating the way our people took care of Mother Earth is what we need to get back to. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So my first question, I'll kick things off. Both Borja and Katie pointed to the importance of sea level rise and coastal erosion as a critically important local climate impact that we need to be thinking about. So for context, for some in the audience, NOAA's 2022 sea level rise technical report projects about 2 to 7 feet of sea level rise by 2100, depending on how aggressively we reduce emissions. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's most recent assessment report projects extreme sea level rise events previously only occurring every 100 years, may be annual events by 2100. And that human populations exposed to such events might increase up to 20% in that time frame. So against that backdrop, we know there are a plethora of different types of response measures that we might consider locally to address sea level rise. One of the more controversial ones, which seems increasingly likely, is planned relocation, or the more controversial term of managed retreat. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this response measure as a possibility, both in general and for Santa Cruz in particular, and if one of you, as the experts on this topic, could start by defining the term for the rest of the audience, that would be great.
So in terms of adaptation strategies, there are a number of them, right? So it's usually hold the line, so you try to raise your seawalls, right? And invest in coastal protection, so everything keeps the same, even if you have higher waves, higher sea levels. Other potential option is managed realignment, where you essentially try to retreat and let the natural processes, recover part of the land that they are claiming. And then the other one is a managed retreat, where you essentially just try to move everything else, by properties and just move assets inland, right? So that's essentially the concept. Obviously, it's highly controversial, as you can, very complex, because there are a number of interests involved, not only economic ones, but also private and public issues. And I'm starting to respond to your question, but I wanted to say something about the chairman. But anyway, so in the Coastal Science and Policy program, there has been some work with the city, which is, I think, is a good approach. So the city is proposing adaptation pathways as a way to know, we don't have to decide now if it's managed retreat or not, but there is a number of scenarios and pathways that we can follow, and this will be determined based on the impacts that we will see in a specific timelines and based on specific triggers, let's say certain beach erosion, number of flooding events per year. So that is going to decide, with the community, with the cities and the different stakeholders, what different actions we may take, and that will be informed for whatever impacts we will see. Something that came out from a publication of the Coastal and Science Policy Program, some of the students last year, they worked with the city, and they were really interested in this topic, and they found that a very important factor is how you communicate managed retreat. So some of the cities in Santa Cruz are very proactive, and they are actively discussing managed retreat and a very feasible and pragmatic solution. Others are totally reactive and are very, against even discussing managed retreat. And part of that, the students found last year that it was because of the community engagement and the communication plan behind it. So this is something that we have a workshop this morning on this topic, actually. And something that came out from some cities in Southern California was precisely that. So they reject so much in not investing in the capacity to prepare a plan that was able to communicate what was at stake and also engage the community in discussing managed retreat options earlier, because now it's too late. So all the effort they put, just because they didn't bring that into the conversation in a certain way, that at the same time, at a certain time, it has backfire. So it's definitely one of the solutions in the portfolio, but I don't. In my personal view, I don't think it has to be decided yet. There are alternative options like these adaptation pathways approaches, and obviously it's not going to be the same in all the communities. If you think about New Orleans, Venice, and Santa Cruz, they are totally in different worlds. So.
Yeah, thank you. Katie, I wonder if you could build on that by speaking to some of the potential environmental justice and climate justice issues that might be associated with managed retreat.
Yeah, it's a great question. Borja and so many others in the room, including a couple of my graduate students, are better situated to answer this question than I am. But I will say, one of the things that I think a lot about are the equity implications, which I think of really in two ways, which is, what do the communities look like that are going to be hit hardest? Is it public or private land? And then if it's private land, what do those communities look like? The city of Santa Cruz has done an incredible amount of work to look at, what that looks like over the coming years in their climate action plan and coastal resilience plans. And there are some really disadvantaged communities in those groups that are going to sort of be hit early and hard. And so as a solution, the ways that I think about it are partial solution, but how are we valuing that land? One of the challenges with managed retreat or with any sort of property buyout in any way is how you value that land. And so, if we're valuing losses of renters really differently than we're valuing losses of homeowners, if we're valuing public very differently than we're valuing private, are we baking in inequity in the process of managed retreat or in any kind of long-term planning? And so there are alternative ways to think about valuation rather than sort of just market value and just market value plus a discount rate. That have more equity considerations in them. And also, I think that this issue of having advanced planning and potentially building in ways to do this better, right? If all of a sudden we're surprised by the fact that a lot of our disadvantaged communities are now being displaced, and we haven't built in ways to create alternatives or to create a plan for those communities, that would be a real shame. But I think Santa Cruz is doing a lot of that advanced planning in a really thoughtful way.
Okay. Go ahead.
And I just wanted to share a thought related to what the chairman said, and also managed retreat and other adaptation options. And you mentioned the IPCC, but the IPCC also says two important things. And one is the next 10 years are critical in terms of how we're going to cope with these impacts and the socioeconomic effects. And the other thing that I found very important to mention here is that one of the most effective ways of implementing adaptation is leveraging local knowledge and indigenous community knowledge. And they say that just from a purely effective perspective. So, I just want to mention that because it's very relevant to the discussion of how we plan and start implementing adaptation.
That actually is a great transition to my next question, which is about participatory decision making. And Sherry, it was really nice to hear you talking about how, in addressing some of the issues you were explaining, that you worked not only with local fishermen but also with scientists and conservationists, et cetera. And I wanted to ask you if there were any efforts to engage with local communities, local Indigenous communities, in creating some of the response measures or developing and designing some of the response measures. And then for Chairman Lopez, curious to hear from your perspective, is there an interest in engaging in these types of response measures? And if so, what do you see as some of the barriers to creating those relationships? And what do you think are some of the necessary steps needed to try to not only make one-off types of engagements in that regard, but to really find ways to institutionalize the incorporation of Indigenous expertise and knowledge into climate response planning?
Yeah, so in terms of the Dungeness Gear Working Group and some of these different efforts, those are efforts that are happening that I am not involved with personally, and so I'm not sure what their level of engagement is with the Indigenous communities. I do know tribal fisheries are managed in collaboration, but slightly different way than many of the other fisheries up and down the coast. Unfortunately, I can't answer that, what efforts have happened around that. Perhaps you might know or might be able to answer.
I'll talk a little bit.
Okay, sure. I'm just going to hand it right over to you then. You go for it.
Okay. Well, first of all, you have to realize that we lost a lot of our indigenous knowledge. I mean, when we started getting involved, when we started recognizing that we need to get back on the path of our ancestors and taking care of Mother Earth, we had lost a lot of our indigenous knowledge, and that was hard. I mean, when you first get started, man, you just feel dumb because is this a food plant or a medicine plant? I don't know. What's the name of this in your language? I don't know. I mean. But then at council, we talked about it, we said we have to realize that it's not our fault that we lost that knowledge, but we also have to realize that we have a responsibility to restore that knowledge, and that's what we've been working on since 2006. And we're restoring a lot of that knowledge, and I feel quite confident that we're going to restore 90 to 95% of that knowledge. Our last traditional Indigenous leader was a traditional healer. And and she left thousands of pages to the Smithsonian Institute regarding the way that we took care of Mother Earth and regarding our songs and our ceremonies and the way that we and a lot of other just knowledge of our tribe. And so with that source document and stuff like that, plus the research we're doing, plus talking to our relationship with other tribes, we're going to restore 90 to 95% of that knowledge. We're going to bring it back. Today we work with the Tribal Marine Stewardship Network. There's 4 tribes: the Talawa, the Rezagini, and the Kasayapomo in our tribe. And a big part of that is to restore traditional stewardship to the coast and to the oceans. And we're working very, very, very cooperatively and hard. We're restoring that knowledge, and we do work with others as well, non-Indigenous people. Currently, we have a project going with UCLA where we're working on eDNA at certain locations in the ocean and stuff like that. And the rivers, we do regular sampling and stuff like that, and we want to start developing a long track record of what species are in that water at that time and such, so that we can start learning how to manage it and bring them back. We participated in the dam removal recently, and now we're working to bring back the salmon. In November, we had a ceremony to call back the salmon, and we did it right on the coast, and that was a beautiful ceremony. And the first time we held ceremony on the coast in over 200 years. So we're bringing that back. The biggest issue there is trust. How do you trust the non-Indigenous people who continue to teach curriculum of our history that is nothing but lies? How do you continue to teach people that don't acknowledge the truth about what happened to us during the California period, where they were paying bounties on scalps for every dead Indian. How do how do you trust that? I found out that the ones that we are working with most are the people in the environmental concerns, because we believe that they truly want to restore Mother Earth. They want to do a lot of healing here. That's what we're talking about tonight. We also believe in many, many ways that they don't know how to do it, and they need us. and there's not enough of us, and therefore we need their numbers to help us, So we need to work together. That's the bottom line, is we need to work together. And our tribe is reaching out. We're restoring our knowledge, and we learn more every day. And we have an active stewardship corps that are actively working on the coast and on the lands, and to restore that stewardship. And those are some activities that we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to the questions from the audience. And the first one is actually also for you, Chairman Lopez. This is a heavy one, and it resonates with me because I teach global climate change politics, and every year more and more students come with bearing this really heavy psychological burden, emotional burden of living in a climate-defined world. So the first question is, what are your perspectives on how we can adapt psychologically or become more resilient in facing all the changes, all the losses we face with climate change?
Wow.
I warned you. It was heavy.
No, that's a heavy one, but it's an important question, and it's one that I'm happy to talk about. Not happy, but that I realize we need to talk about. Before we can heal Mother Earth, we have to heal ourselves. Our tribe for the last 13 years, October was 13 years, we hold bi-monthly wellness meetings where we work to restore our indigenous knowledge, our culture, our identity, etc. Now, and then we work to deal with issues of addiction, depression, suicide, rape. We deal with all that at our wellness meetings. And we deal with it really hard. What we learned through our wellness meetings is that perpetrators need to heal too. And I've been talking about this for a number of years now, and not once has anybody said, that's true, we need to work on it. And stuff like that. That's another issue that comes up with trust. If the perpetrators don't realize there's anything wrong or they need to do anything, how can you have trust? But by working together, by having healthy relationships, and by addressing it in an honest, open way, I kind of forgot the question already. But I got stuck in that wellness.
How can we psychologically adapt?
To psychologically adapt, we have to realize what it takes to have a healthy relationship. And we got to work towards that healthy relationship. And that means one that's honest and truthful, and that's patient and that's kind. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Well, Katie, that was a tough act to follow, but the next one's for you. So what are the prospects for Western and Central Pacific Island nations to adapt to tuna range shifts through tuna farming?
Ooh, curveball. Tuna farming. Wow, okay, so if there are experts out there right now, this might be controversial, but very little, I would say. Where to start? So tuna farming, aquaculture farming, a lot of folks generally think of aquaculture as being sort of a one-to-one transition from wild-caught fish to aquaculture. Wild-caught fish are going down, we'll increase aquaculture, and we'll solve all of our sort of food security problems. That's not quite right for several reasons, and I won't go into them too deeply, but the first one is really just markets, right? So if you're farming tuna, it's generally pretty costly. You're generally trying to recoup your costs by selling it to people who have more money than a lot of the folks in small island developing states. Also, because we're really talking about in places like Tokelau, in places like Kiribati, this is a huge, It's over half, up to 84% of the entire government revenue of these places. And so, if you think about if we're going to farm tuna in remote locations in the middle of the Pacific, we're not going to incur that kind of profit to be able to sort of one-to-one supplant it in these contexts. There are people who are farming tuna, and they're farming tuna successfully, and they're farming it in kind of specific places for specific markets, which find me afterward or find other folks in this room, because we can have a long conversation about that, but not a good alternative in this scenario.
Great, thanks.
Yeah.
The next one's for you, Borja. What is the role of private sector insurance in climate adaptation and policy?
Yeah, very good point. It's relatively small at the moment, but is becoming increasingly larger. And I would say not only insurance, but climate finance. I mean, there is a huge global adaptation gap, so we know that we need to adapt faster, and we need to implement more adaptation. So the key question is, who's going to pay for it? And the insurance industry deals with all these catastrophes. I mean, for people who don't know the insurance and the reinsurance sector, these are the guys that will pay for part of the losses after Katrina, Sandy, the big storms, the big disasters. What they don't cover will be going to public budgets, right? So it will be paid by either citizens or public money. So that's the main reason for having reinsurance against catastrophes. There is an increasing interest in leveraging more climate finance for adaptation and mitigation purposes. The only issue right now is that most of the funding is going to mitigation efforts, so reducing carbon offsets, etc., etc. We need to continue doing that and even scale it, but we also need to invest more in adaptation. That's where the private sector comes in, because they have a vested interest in protecting some of these assets, but also developing new products so they can manage increasing climate-related risk, because that's their business. So there is a lot of initiative in the private sector in that regard, not only in the public sector and also universities, but as we are starting to see in the last 5 years has been incredible how much innovation has happened, and we will see even more innovation in the next 5 years. I mean, if you think about mitigation, because it's where most of the money is going right now. I mean, the carbon credits. I mean, there are so many startups and new companies in the last 2 years just focusing on mobilizing private climate finance. And I think we will see that in adaptation soon enough, and we need to see that. But there is a lot of interest from the private sector in this kind of mechanisms, and also in nature resolutions. I mean, there is, that they are totally supporting these global initiatives very strongly.
Okay, thank you. Sherry, you're up. Tell us what we can do as individuals. How can we use our wallets to buy the best seafood and support conservation?
Yeah, no, a great question. I mean, first and foremost, we can support our local fishing community, and you're pretty safe buying U.S. seafood because it is very highly regulated with science-based management, and there's a huge percentage of the seafood that we consume here in the U.S. is imported, oftentimes from illegal or unregulated fisheries, oftentimes using slave labor and other horrible means of catching that fish. We just don't know. Whereas with certainty here there are very strict regulations, so it is sustainable. And even more, it's sort of the concentric circle. Supporting local is really important because it also is supporting our local economy. We do have these local fishermen and women who are out there trying to catch meals. It's about food security as well, which is something that happened during the pandemic that we really became aware of, is the importance of being able to rely on this healthy protein right here. A number of programs emerged throughout California, including one that we have, which is a community seafood program in which seafood was purchased from the fishing community and donated to local food banks and emergency food relief programs. And these programs are continuing. During the pandemic, I think it tripled the food demand tripled at some of these places, or even higher. So support buy local, ask questions. Don't assume it's local. A lot of people just don't really know and assume, tilapia is from the Monterey Bay, and it's not.
Thanks. That's what I thought. Thanks. So this is kind of a one that might require a little thought. So maybe I'll ask it, and then I'll ask a light question while you think about it. This is for anyone who wishes to respond. What is one thing you've learned about climate justice from an Indigenous person who is not Chairman Lopez? And maybe while you take a couple minutes to think about that, I'll ask Borja a more light question, which is, how might increased wave intensity impact surfing in Santa Cruz?
Yeah, I don't know how many times I have had the same question. So part of our science is demonstrating that waves are getting larger, and there is more energy going into the system, obviously. And we in an article a few years ago, we published this new metric, which is equivalent for is a long-term signal of climate change in ocean waves, and we call it global wave power. And that's a way you can measure over years and seasons, how much energy you have in ocean waves. And we saw that it was increasing, and now we are working to projecting that into the future. So what we can say is we have historical evidence that waves have been increasing in all oceans, and obviously that has implications for coastal processes, flooding, erosion, etc. For surfers, I would say that we can say that energy is increasing. That doesn't mean that the surfing conditions will be better or worse, but at the very minimum, let's say like a typical El Niño year will be more frequent in the future, right? In a mean climate into the future. So I guess you can take it as that's good news for surfing, not so good news for other sectors. But
Thanks. Katie, what do you think?
I'll take it. Yes, it's a great question. It's very specific, but it's really good. So is it the last time, or what's the lesson? Or
The best one.
The best one. Okay, so I don't work with a lot of Indigenous communities in the States, but I do work with Indigenous communities in the Pacific. And so when I think of the most recent, or kind of the most impactful lesson that I think of, it really came from Indigenous Pacific Islanders, specifically. The conversation I'm thinking of is with folks from Tonga, Samoa, Kiribati, and Fiji. And so, and the lesson was really about the importance of agency when it comes to climate change. And so, in a lot of places, Indigenous folks are kind of cast as the victims of all of this, and that sometimes that helps create a certain narrative, but that a lot of times it can kind of feel like their agency is being robbed in this situation, and that they, once again, are kind of having something taken from them by white Western culture, and they can't do anything about it. And in some ways, that is true, and it's part of the thing that we're here to talk about and plan about. But in other ways, it's really important to claim that agency, right? And to feel like you are able to control the narrative about your people and about your place and about your resources. And that in itself is empowering. And that it helps in other really practical ways as well, which is to kind of create a creative space for solution making, rather than, if you live on a low-lying Pacific island, then your home is going to be inundated, and then what will you do? It's like, okay, no, now we have to, there are ways to think about our sovereignty and our agency and our culture and our ability to plan and adapt and mitigate that is imperative in having that sense of agency. And so I think that, for me, has sort of been something I try to listen to and take into account as much as possible.
Thanks. Yeah. Anyone else want to take a step?
Yeah, I want to share a couple of examples, and one of them is negative and the other positive. So the negative one is both are from Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And one of them is the city of Saint Louis in Senegal, and that's like the historical capital of Senegal. It was the French colony. beautiful, but they have like tremendous issues. And one of them is beach erosion. This is a shoreline that is being heavily eroded. The government is relocating 800 families. And most of them fisheries who live by the coast, and essentially they have their boats there, and the storms have destroyed their houses. So now the government's decided like they will move them 5-10 kilometers inland, fishermen, who actually need to be on the coast. So that's an example of managed retreat, of forced managed retreat that is not going to work just because of cultural issues. And actually, I remember somebody from the World Bank saying, and this was the lead person for Sub-Saharan Africa, saying the solution is relocation, but densification. So you start building higher buildings. Well, there is a cultural issue, and it's just the families in Senegal, they don't like living on top of each other. So every slot of land belongs to a family, right? So there is also very limited solutions in that. So that's a very complex problem that doesn't have a solution, and the government is trying to use a managed retreat approach, but it's not working for a number of reasons. So it's very complex to resolve. The other one that I will say on a positive note is in Dakar, also in Senegal, the capital. And this project is a stormwater management project. Dakar used to have a lot of urban flooding issues because Sub-Saharan Africa is developing rapidly. I mean, they build streets and houses just before you have public civil infrastructure in place. Is one of the most rapidly developing areas in the world. And so they have these huge urban flooding issues, and this is another project from the World Bank, and essentially has received several awards because they have resolved the urban runoff issues, but the design, after bringing all this expertise around the world and consortiums of firms, it was actually given by a local engineer. And essentially said, no, let's go to the natural water sets before we build all these houses and urban infrastructure. And this is where the water used to, go after rainfalls, etc. Used to have these wetlands. And essentially, the engineering design came to build back or try to re-engineer back what they have built in there. So essentially, it's just working on the natural streams and the natural areas where the water was stored, and just trying to engineer a system. Obviously, it cannot be the natural system anymore, but trying to recirculate the water as it used to flow before building all that. And it has received a number of international awards, but that's a very good example of how the local knowledge really help to inform a very efficient and effective engineering solution.
Thank you. It's nearly time for me to turn things over to Dean Koch, but I'd like to give Chairman Lopez the last word. My instinct is that you may have an open-ended response to some of what's been said, but if not, I have a question for you.
Well, let's go with that question.
Okay, I was wrong. Are there any ocean stewardship practices that you and the Amamutsin tribal band are working to reintroduce in the region? Can you talk us through some of the barriers to reintroduction and what you need from the community or more broadly to overcome those barriers?
Well, a big part of that is access. I mean, we still have to pay for a fishing license. We still have to pay to go on to parks land when we want to go to the ocean. We still have, and access is a really big one. That's a hard one. The other thing is what we are. Well, the one I keep going to is restoring sacredness. I mean, just when you wake up every day, say, just offer a prayer and such, and just recognize that it's sacred. Just something that we're working on actively now is, we are looking to do a lot of restoration work. Is where we are. We're just trying to recover from the past, what has happened. I mean, we work with the harmful algae blooms, and trying to deal with that issue. We're dealing with the purple sea urchin and the bull kelp issue and the sea stars, and such like that. But, there's nothing now that we're doing as far as restoring traditional stewardship until we get the healing done and also restoring the knowledge of that as well.
Great. Thank
So
you.
we're in that process. It's in process.
Thank you. So please join me in thanking the panelists before I turn things over. And I'll turn things over to Dean Koch of the Physical and Biological Sciences Division at UC Santa Cruz.
Yeah, thanks, everybody. So I'm going to start with some thanks. We've reached the end of our program, and I'm going to start with a few thanks and then a couple reflections. So first, I want to thank the audience, both the folks off in the ether and the folks here in the room, for great questions. And the point of this event was to engage with the community, and I really feel like we've done that with the questions that came in. I want to thank the staff here at the Seymour Center who welcomed us and organized this event. Really done a tremendous job. The staff in the Physical and Biological Sciences and the Social Science Division, the staff that work with Kathryn and I, that busted their, that really worked really hard to get this done. And finally, there are event staffs here from UCSC that are supporting us, and I want to give them some thanks as well. So. Lastly, I want to thank the panel and our moderator. When we started this climate conference, we used to call it, our goal was to spark a conversation here in the community, to have Santa Cruz understand, in some sense, the value of having this giant university on the hill and down here on the coastal campus. What's the value to the town of that? And one thing we thought we could do would be to begin a conversation around the climate crisis. I'll call it a crisis. And bring the expertise that we have on the Hill and here on the coastal campus to address that, but really not just the expertise on our faculty or on our staff, but the expertise that we can attract to engage in these conversations and make it, offer it to the community. And that you exemplified that tonight. I really, really appreciate the conversations that you had. And the last thing I'll say about it is that the goal of this conference, which has been the goal for, I can't remember when we started the first year, 2013, really the vision for the Seymour Marine Discovery Center that Jonathan laid out as a place where not only will people come and learn and get excited about the oceans and get excited about this thing that they love, but they'll connect with something that will allow them to have an impact on saving it, on making sure it's here in the future. It's something that came up a lot of time, many times when we do the conference. People would stand up and ask a question. We'd kind of depress them a little bit, and they'd want to know, what can I do? What can I do here? And the vision that Jonathan articulated, and that I think this conference, this panel discussion embodies, is that in action. So I'm going to thank you all again for coming and wish you a good night. So, yeah.